Hi, this is Nessa from Infinitely Zero's channel. Today is Sunday, February 11th, and yeah, I wanted to talk to you guys about what is gauge. What is this thing? People keep talking about it. Um, I decided I would go over my experiences with it. Um, and I also wanted to talk about a few other items that I had completely forgotten about mentioning in my last video. And I also just got a new webcam as well as a tripod. So I'm testing out that equipment, so please let me know how the video quality looks as well as the audio. Hopefully it's picking up everything okay. Yeah, so I had mentioned in a poll concerning starting a kind of like a swatch along, and we go learning skills as we go. And I had referenced this book, the Crochet Skill Building Workshop, and it has some stitch along swatches. Um, Thanks so much to those who responded to the poll questions. And I know Amy from Hooked on Wishing Crochet with Amy. Thanks so much for responding back, and it sounded like you're really excited to work on this with me and that you ordered the book, and I know you mentioned that it was probably arriving Friday. I haven't had a chance to email you yet. I'm sorry. So let me know, not only just Amy, but anyone else who wants to participate in this, if you've had a chance to get your books or not. I was trying to maybe think of starting this soon. I'd also like to sort of gauge on, depending on how many projects you have going on, how often we want to do some of these swatches. I was thinking maybe every 2 weeks or once a month. I think every week is a lot. For me personally, I don't think I can keep up with that and do the swatch and do a video and plus other content that I'm trying to release and other projects that I'm trying to work on. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on that, on the frequency. Again, I'm thinking maybe 2 weeks or once a month might be good, even every few months. Along with that too, I wanted to talk about, I wanted to kind of show one of my makes. So the Mama G Gear channel, she's having a make along that ends at the end of February, and it's a monochromatic make along, so you can actually use any craft. And it's mostly all black and white items, maybe with a pop of color. And I actually have one that I've been working on from last year, which was a Tunisian crochet along from Heart Hook Home, and I never finished it. So I was thinking this would be the perfect project for that. And this is that project. Showing you real quick. This is the right side. So it was actually to make different, kind of stitch sampler blanket with Tunisian crochet stitches. Instead, what I decided to do was, so this way it's a long strip. I decided to make it a join as you go, just because I don't like weaving in ends, and I really don't care for sewing together a bunch of squares and dealing with all that joining. So I was like, let me just make it like this, and I think we need about 2 squares per stitch, and I kind of stopped around 5 or 6 of the squares. So yeah, so these are some I've made. This is like the reverse stitch. That's the Tunisian simple stitch. Sorry that I'm blocking shouldn't be blocking my face. That's the knit stitch. There we go. That's better if I do it on the side. There's another Tunisian simple stitch square, and then I just sort of adjust like how the width of the stitches are to continue on with the next stitch. And that was the top square, which is a simple stitch, and then I go on to do the reverse stitch, and I just sort of grab it and seam it like that. And then down here, Sorry. And then at the end of this one, I was starting a new stitch on the bottom. This is, whoa, it got all tangled. This is the correct side. Sorry, I'm not used to this new setup, and then that's like a different stitch that I was starting down there. So I think I was using, oh, and I was using Ice Yarn's Magic Worsted. So as you can see, it's like an ombre yarn, but it's grays, so I think it might be perfect for this. So hopefully, if I have enough time, I'll get to working on this, and I'll keep you guys posted on my progress. So yeah, and also they set up a Facebook group for their make-along, and they just finished talking more about the make-along on their last live session. Thank you so much for the shout-out. So she had mentioned my channel, and then Dee's Creative Hands had also shouted me out this weekend and mentioned to check out my channel, so that's really cool. So yeah, so those are the two items that I wanted to talk about, and now we can get into gauge. So for gauge, I decided to also, you know, they also cover that in this book. I know a lot of designers talk about it. What the heck is this thing, right? So I will be honest, and I will say throughout more than 20 years of my crochet journey, I did not gauge swatch. I also didn't make like wearables where size was like really important, like a sweater, you know, scarves, yeah, sure, no problem. I would make those, and hats, and blankets, right? So in 2020, I started starting to make sweaters, right? And I learned how to crochet in Spanish. I learned from my grandma's friend and my grandma. Gauge wasn't a thing. Like, I taught myself how to read patterns, but I don't know. I mean, I thought gauge was like a suggestion. It was like this thing that was written on top of the patterns. Yeah, and that was it, right? So I come to learn through time and through taking different workshops and listening to different designers and all this, you know, like I thought it was like a suggestion from designers, right? I had some mishaps when I was creating wearables where they came out like way too big, they came out too small. I have this example of this sweater that I made that came out too big because I'm pretty sure I did not gauge swatch. And this designer's patterns kind of run too big anyways, and I crochet loosely, so this is the sweater that I made. It's a pattern from Make and Do Crew. Yes, you can see how long this sweater is. It was not meant to be this long, but when I wear it, it comes down to my knees. Oh, and the arms were super long too, and I made them a little shorter. So whenever I've done her patterns, like they come out too big, some of them come out too small. I just realized the one that I just finished showing for the Sherpa pullover sweater in my last video, that the pattern calculations of how much yarn was used was totally off. So how they must have had an error there and how they calculated the yardage in the pattern per skein, and then when you calculate it in reality per skein, because they have like less yardage, it was like a really big discrepancy of like more than like 400 yards. Anyways, so I was like, you know, what the heck is going on, right? Like, you know, it was just overwhelming, it was daunting, and why can't I get these sweaters to fit right when I was making them? So the reason is because gauge is actually, I'm going to give you the actual definition here. It refers to the number of stitches and the number of rows of a given length of fabric. So what that means is that everybody has, this is like separate from gauge, right? This is just common knowledge. Everybody has like different tension. As I've come to learn through the years, right? Our tension can vary widely by the types of hooks we use, if they're metal, if they're plastic, if they're resin, if they're bamboo, if we're having a bad day, you know, like our mood changes, the temperature changes, also the humidity all of this can affect your gauge, as well as the type of yarn you're using, the type of fibers the yarn has, as well as the color, because sometimes the color from the dies changes the yarn, and it can potentially change your gauge, right? That's not always the case. So I also learned in this whole process, besides, you know, those variable factors, that when you're doing all this, you got to measure. So the gauge is done. Let's back up right a little bit. So gauge is done by making usually a square. Well, sometimes it's in the square, sometimes it's in the round. We're going to keep it complicated for this video. We're just going to kind of assume that they're in a square form. A lot of times the pattern designer will say gauge on the top. If they have any special stitches there, sometimes they include them in the gauge, and they'll explain that, and they'll have like a little mini pattern on how to do the gauge. Gauge in the US, in US terms, is usually a 4-inch by 4-inch square, right? You're measuring what the distance is between the stitches, because your tension is unique and individual by like whatever is going on for you with that day, with that hook that you picked, with that yarn that you picked, with the color of the yarn, all of that are, you know, it has all those variables that come into play. So all of that can change a lot, person to person, day by day, and all those things. I mean, I wouldn't like worry too much if you've been crocheting a long time and, oh crap, you know, maybe my tension is really off by day. You can kind of see it when you're crocheting. So we're not going to worry about that. Let's just assume for now that, you know, your tension is good because you've been doing this for a while, and you know, you've written down what hook you're using, or you keep that hook with the project, or you're ideally working on the project all the way till the end, which doesn't always happen. We know this, but let's go to this fantasy land, right? So, so another tip there, right? So a lot of times they'll have this, right, and they'll measure 4 inches or 10 centimeters for how many stitches belong within this, like, let's say for example, square that you're making to check what your gauge is, right? So within this, the way you measure it matters. I'll go into more details about that once I start showing the gauge swatches. So how you determine where the spacing is, how you count this, that all matters. Apparently, gauge is a lot more precise in centimeters, because it's obviously a smaller, you know, measuring distance, you know, measuring unit of distance. And of course it's used worldwide. I think if I ever go ahead and decide to release patterns and all that, I'll probably include inches and centimeters and centimeters. But that's just, you know, a personal choice. But apparently you can get a lot more exact gauge if you measure out the centimeters. I've been only really doing inches, so I'm gonna talk about what I know. So I've heard a lot of designers say that it's better to do a gauge swatch that's bigger than what you need of the 4 inches by 4 inches. So maybe you make it a few more rows and make it a few more, you know, a bit wider with a few more stitches to start. Ideally, it would be add 2 or 3 inches to the top and to the bottom. So maybe make it like a 6 by 6 inches by 6 inch square, 7 inches by 7 inch square. It'll vary depending the type of stitches you use, if they'll be odd numbered or even numbered. And the reason for this is because your stitches can vary when they get to the edges. So therefore, it's not as accurate. The other thing too is like, well, why the hell am I doing 4 inches, right? Why not just do 1 inch, get it over with, and call it a day? Well, the reason is because you're kind of doing an average. So if you have a little more amount, you get a better kind of accurate reading of how many stitches you're getting in those inches. Some stitches that are more complicated are a little harder to see when you're counting, so that's a thing. It's just a thing you gotta live with. You know, the same if you pick a really dark colored yarn and you're gonna try to do gauge in that. So another question you might have is, well, why should I gauge, right? What a waste of time. Like, oh my God, I totally want to start my project now. I don't want to like waste time doing these little swatches that are so annoying. So I'm going to tell you why. So one of the reasons is, besides the designer putting a lot of time to like write this out and include this information for you so that you could, you know, hopefully get a good fitting pattern. Oh, and the other thing is too, so usually gauge is used for sweaters and for items that it's important to have a good fit, or if you have an X measured amount of yarn. So like if you bought an Afghan kit and you know you kind of crochet a little looser or crochet a bit tighter, especially looser, and you're kind of worried that you might run out of yarn, it's a good idea to do a little pattern swatch, you know, like a little gauge swatch. And, you know, you can see, oh crap, I'm off, you know, so that's not going to look right. I might run out of yarn, you know, let me modify that. So that's one reason, right? Second reason is in a wearable garment like a sweater. If you're off an inch, or if you're off like a stitch or 2 stitches, it can make a huge difference, because now all of a sudden you're multiplying that by like 20, by 30, by 100. So all of a sudden you're like one little stitch off now made it a whole 1 or 2 sizes bigger. Yes, it's amazing that that happens, but it does. So when you start thinking about that, about the time that you're putting into your project and about the yarn being used, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you're spending maybe 2 weeks to 2 months to 4 months to a year to make this sweater, and now it's the wrong size, and now you have to redo it again, wouldn't it have made more sense to just spend the 20 minutes to do a gauge swatch ahead of time to know that you're on the right gauge? I mean, I think it does. Just time-wise that way. You can reuse the yarn. You can use the gauge swatches and other ideas of other things to do. You can use you can use them as samples. Another thing too with gauge swatches is they're great to figure out, like, if you like how the yarn feels. Like maybe you don't like how the yarn feels. Maybe you're substituting this yarn, and definitely recommended if you're using a different yarn than from what the designer originally intended, that you do a gauge swatch, because it might not have the same drape. It might be too holey. It might be too tight. It might be too stiff. Sometimes it's recommended that you block and wash the gauge swatch to see how it is at the end. I've never done that. I've heard that some patterns will say that in the pattern if you need to do that. Another great reason to gauge watch is you get to see what it looks like in that color, you know, of using that type of yarn. And if it's like a self-striping yarn, it'll color pool in different ways, so you can see that. And sometimes, you know, once you get that gauge down, you can decide, like, you know what, I want this to be a thicker sweater, so I'm going to modify this. I'm going to use a much thicker weight yarn. So then you can, if you already met gauge, then you know, okay, well, I can do like a size larger and, you know, decrease my hook size, right? Or, you know, like, okay, I want to make this with a thinner yarn. I want to make the same, you know, I have an example where I did a sweater and I wanted to make the sweater with a thicker yarn. So I made the size medium. I modified the hook size. Like, I already knew I met gauge with, like, let's say a 5mm hook. So it's like, okay, if I use this other hook size with that, and I was testing the pattern too, so I also had suggestions from the designer of what to do to modify this, but with changing the hook size a specific amount of stitches with that new yarn and making it a smaller size, like a medium, I was then able to make the right large size that I wanted for the sweater. So you can do those kind of calculations. And also, if you want anyone to be able to replicate this pattern of yours, including yourself at a later date, it's really helpful if you write a gauge swatch, you know, like if you write a gauge there and what your gauge was. And a lot of times too, for like sweaters, for example, you can use that square as part of the pocket. So that's a great design feature to include there. So now that I've been talking your ear off, right, let me show you some stuff. So I started designing, I started testing these patterns for a designer that sells her patterns like in fall. To some of the sweaters I decided to test, I needed a gauge swatch, right? And I'm usually my gauge is off because I crochet loosely. So for example, I figured I would show you some gauge swatches, and that's why I have like all these sweaters around me too. So that recent sweater that I just showed in my previous video, the berry stitch, this was one of the gauge swatches I was doing to try to match gauge, or I couldn't match it, and the pattern called for an 8mm hook, and I had to keep decreasing down until, you know, I used a 6mm hook to get the right gauge. And it even turned out when I was trying to do it with this yarn that I wasn't getting the correct gauge, and I had to try a different yarn, and I had to switch over to that yarn. And my first initial gauge swatch for that pattern was this one. I wanted to do it in the tweed, in the Brava tweed, which is this yarn. This is where I started out. And and another tip too, right? When you're doing gauge swatches, it's great to figure out the stitch. Like if it's a new stitch and it's a more advanced stitch, it's a great opportunity for you to practice the stitch too. So here I realized that I was not doing the stitch correctly. And another thing too, the yarn was too dark, so I couldn't really see where to go in. Exactly. Because this is like a combination stitch where you loop around a bunch of times and then you have to slip stitch. So I was like, okay, this is not going to work for me to do a whole sweater that I'm testing a pattern and I can't see the stitches. Hence why I did the lighter color gauge swatch and why the sweater ended up gray. Now that I've done the sweater again and I definitely know that stitch, I can, if I want to later on, try and do it in a darker color. So that's another suggestion. So when I was, and that was the Wild Berry pullover sweater. And I have a link to that and talk about that sweater more in my last video. So the Alex sweater, these are some gauge swatches I was doing when I was trying to figure out what hook size I needed. And this was like nice and drapier. But this was the initial hook size, but I wasn't meeting gauge with this one. So I had to go to this one. And even though it was kind of stiff, but again, this pattern was written for a DK weight yarn. This is a 4 weight. And and a bigger hook size. This is the final sweater, which came out as a large. And actually, it was pretty stiff when I first made it, but after washing it and putting it in the washing machine and all that and drying, it came out a lot softer, so that came out great. And an example when I was mentioning about the color thing, when I was first trying to get the gauge for that sweater, and I was doing, and I tried it out in DK weight yarn, this was that gauge swatch I did from this Lion Brown ice cream yarn. I'm not going to go into the yarns for this one. It's biscuit cream. And not sure if you noticed, but I don't like how the color pools there. That looks weird. So the sweater would have been like all patchy, if you can imagine that, like going all big. And I'm like, ugh. So this is a great reason of why to make a gauge swatch or why to make a sample swatch. I was able to see this without wasting my time and being halfway through a sweater and not liking how the color pooled. And that's what that's called when you lay it out. And sometimes it takes a lot of tries to get this right. Like I'm about to test a Tunisian crochet sweater pattern cardigan for the designer. And it has to be furry blue clay yarn, but I didn't buy the same yarn that they're using, so I decided to get different yarns. And these are some of the different gauge swatches I was getting. she's using a 5mm Tunisian hook. Apparently my Tunisian gauge is a lot tighter, which I'm not used to because my crochet, I usually crochet looser. So I had to do a bunch of samples, and I was curious on how it would look with this yarn. So I did this, and I did another one in the tan of this yarn. This is the Knob Hill Artesia. It was horrible to frog. I mean, I literally tried to frog the other one, it knotted, I just cut it and had to throw it away, and that's how much of a mess it made. But the yarn itself has these white lines which look really cool, which make really like nice stitch definition. So in figuring that out, I had also ordered these other yarns, and I'm here trying to figure out the gauge swatches and changing the hook sizes. So these are other little samples I made, and these I didn't make as big as the 6x6 because I just initially wanted to count just how many stitches, and this is all Tunisian simple stitch, just how many stitches I was getting overall. And this because I just wasn't meeting gauge. So yeah, she started at 5mm. I eventually had to go all the way up to 7mm to meet her gauge. So I did that one in blue. I had that gray one. I think this was finally the one that I met gauge. This was the red one. I don't think you can even see this on camera very well of how you can see the stitches. And this is the brown one. And the Tunisian simple stitches, the actual stitches are these little vertical lines for each of the rows. I'll use this one to show you. This is the right side. This one to show you how to do gauge swatch. So some folks, they use measuring tape. That's fine. I do that too. I've heard that if you use the ones that are retractable, that those kind of, I guess, with using them too much, get stretchy and then they're not an accurate reading. So let's see if I can. Well, I'll show you in a bit. I'll have to change the camera angle to show a more detailed look. Let me so yeah, so that's one way. I'll change the camera angle and show it more closely when we're counting the stitches. So you know, you do it leveled, and you count the 4 inches, and you count how many stitches are in the 4 inches. And that's your horizontal gauge, which is more important than your vertical gauge. I mean, they're both important, but you can actually, and then this is how you calculate the vertical gauge, and how many rows you need, and you count the level of rows. You can always kind of add or subtract the rows for that. So a lot of times they want you more to meet horizontal gauge, and then you can modify how much you make by adding or decreasing rows. You can also, I just recently bought this one, but this one doesn't really work for gauge because it really doesn't have like the whole 4 inches, but I did get it for the wraps per inch, so I thought that was pretty cool. So a lot of times I've used this one where I just like put it, you know, to the 4 inches here, and put it against that and then see how it fits. And then I wanted to show another example where I don't think I did a gauge swatch, and I was working on a cocoon cardigan sweater, and I was working on it. I didn't like how the stitches were looking, and then I go to see, and I'm like, man, this thing's huge. What the hell's going on? And I don't like the way it's coming out. So then I decided, hey, you know what? Let me do this whole thing. And, you know, this was when the project was already this much. I was like, you know, I didn't do the gauge swatch. Let me go ahead, measure my gauge, see what, if it matches theirs, right? And I was pretty off. So that explained a lot. So I changed what hook size I was using. So here's the thing, right? If you have, like, let's say, for example, 10 stitches for the 4 inches and the pattern says the gauge is 13 stitches for 4 inches that they got. How you fix that is because you have too few stitches for the amount of the 4 inches. You need to decrease your hook size. And it's guessing how many times you need to decrease that to try to match that. And the reverse is true too. If you're a tight crocheter or tight knitter, right? This applies for knitting too. And for Tunisian crochet. And if you get too many stitches within that 4-inch mark, more than they have, then you need to go up hook sizes until you get the number of stitches that they got, or the number of rows, if you want to match the rows, right? So then after fixing that and modifying that, I made this cocoon cardigan, which I think I've shown before on the channel. So yeah. Yeah, I don't think I can pause it well. So let me show you. Where did I put that little, there it is, that little sample. I have all of this stuff everywhere. So here you would start at the 0 mark to the 4 inches. And there's other tutorials and other videos and books where they explain this better. Yeah, this is really hard to look at when you're doing this. And then you actually count how many stitches are in those 4 inches, and the same vertically, how many rows, and that gives you your vertical gauge. The other one is your horizontal gauge. Another tip too is when you're doing this, if you see there's like spaces and the gaps, and sometimes it fits halfway through, so make sure when you start that you start at right at the beginning of the stitch, like there. And if you count that gap that's in the beginning of the stitch, you don't count it at the end of the stitch. So that's important. So you only count like the gap on one of the sides, usually the side and the front. And then also if you're like halfway, you know, like the ruler matches halfway, I think you're supposed to, you don't round. You count like, you count the stitch as like a whole stitch. Ideally you would try to get it where all the stitches fit in there. So I think that's everything. I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, so I'm exhausted. Anyways, thanks. Have a good night. Have a good weekend. Let me know if you kind of have any questions about this. There's a lot more resources. This is sort of my take on it and my experiences on it, and what it is. And again, some are more complicated than others. I suggest it's a good idea. It's honestly not that much work. It's just a little square. And it'll save you a lot of time and a lot of frustration and a lot of headache in the long run. So yeah. So anyways, thanks for watching. If you like my content, please click like and subscribe. And thanks so much. And I now reached about 200 subscribers, so that's exciting. Yay. Yeah. And I think that's it for now. Bye.